1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul just finished talking to us in chapter 8 about how we're to lay down our preferences for one another, that we're not to sin against the Lord by tempting other people or by using our privileges or our freedoms as really in an unhealthy way that might lead others to stumble. He basically just says, be conscious of one another. Consider one another greater than yourself. Put other people first. It's a biblical principle. Love your neighbor as yourself. Here we go, chapter 9. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. He says, look, he goes, have I not spoken to you? Have I not led you in the Lord? Have I not been a pastor to you? Have I not been a great influence in your life? He says, this is my defense to those who speak against me. The way that I've lived, the way that I've modeled Christ to you is my defense. My life, my walk is my defense. He says in verse 4, don't we have the right to food and drink? He's continuing his discussion. He says, don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Peter? Peter had a wife. We learned that in the Gospels because Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law. Therefore, he had a wife. Or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right to not work for a living? And I'm going to explain this in a moment. He's going to give a couple examples, and I'm going to explain this. Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk? Do I say this merely in human authority? Doesn't the law say the same thing? For as it is written in the law, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. He's quoting Deuteronomy 25. He says, is it about oxen that God is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us because whoever plows and threshes should be able to do so in hope of sharing of the harvest. Basically is what he's saying. Don't I have the right to make a demand of you? He's saying to the church, he says, I have the right to demand something from you. He says, I've planted and I've watered and God's brought an increase in this church. He says, I could ask things of you. He says, a soldier doesn't work for free. A planter of harvest doesn't do it for free, expects a yield from the crop. A shepherd expects to drink of the milk of the animals that he watches over. He says, it's not wrong for me to ask something of you, is basically what he is saying to the church. As their pastor, he's saying, it's not wrong for me to ask you to provide a living wage for me. That's what he's saying. However, he goes, if we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? He says, don't we have the right to make a demand of you or to ask something of you for all that we've done for you spiritually? Don't we have the right and the authority? And he says we do, but he's basically making an example coming off of chapter 8. He says, just because I have the right to doesn't mean that I have to. And he continues in verse 12, but we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. He's taking the argument he made in chapter 8, and he's giving an example in chapter 9. He says, I have the right to ask things of you. I have the right to make a demand of you. He said, however, I choose not to. I've told you this before. Paul would often make tents during the day, lead small groups at nights, and have church on the weekends. Paul said, I didn't want to be a burden to you. He said, even though I had the right to, it didn't mean that I had to. He's taking that principle of all things are lawful, but not all things are beneficial. Just because I have the right to doesn't mean I need to, or I have to, or it's the right thing to do in the situation. Don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and that those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar? In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. He says the Lord's commanded this. This isn't anything new. This isn't anything out of the ordinary. We saw it in the Old Testament with the Levites. From the tithes and from the offerings, they were compensated so that they could live and continue to work from the Lord and be focused on the things of God. He said this isn't anything new. Verse 15, but I have not used any of these rights. He says, even though I had the right to make a demand from you, he said, I didn't do it. He said, am I not writing this in the hope that you will do such things for me? For I would rather die than allow anyone to deprive me of this boast. He says, and I'm not asking you for money right now. He says, I want you to know that I have the right to, but I'm choosing not to. He's modeling something for them. He said, for when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, since I'm compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. He says, God's got a call in my life. He said, I can't not preach the gospel. He said, if I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I am simply discharging the trust committed to me. What then is my reward? He says, this is our reward, just this, that in preaching the gospel, I may offer it free of charge, and so not make full use of my rights as a preacher of the gospel. He says, this is my reward, that I'm able to do this to bless you. And basically building off of chapter 8, what is my reward if someone chooses not to eat meat or if someone chooses not to drink? My reward is that I'm laying down myself. I'm dying to my flesh because I desire to do everything that I can to share the heart and the love of Jesus Christ with you. It's a beautiful picture Paul's sharing with them. Verse 19, your heading might say Paul's use of his freedom. Though I am free and belong to no one, I've made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. He said, look, I'm free. I know I'm free. He goes, but I choose to be a slave. Such an interesting perspective, in our world, as there's this mentality, people want to be free. People don't want to serve. I've noticed this go throughout our world. People aren't willing to serve like they used to. Something in our current generation, it says, I want to be served, not I want to serve. Paul said, nope. That's not the gospel. He said, I want to serve. I've made myself a slave. To the Jew, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law because I'm under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. He says, look, when I'm talking to a Jewish person, I relate to them in their Jewish culture. When I'm talking to someone who's an unbeliever, I relate to them and how they live their life. He goes, I don't just sit there and bring out doctrine to an unbeliever. I would be wasting my time. He says, I appeal to them relationally. I appeal to their heart. I share with them what my testimony, what Christ has done in my life. He says to the Jew, he probably would start talking to them through the Old Testament. We see that in Hebrews when he writes, I believe he wrote the letter to the Hebrews. It's very doctrinally sound. It's tied a lot with the Old Testament. Why? That would speak to a Jew. But when he speaks to someone who's an unbeliever, he doesn't just bring out Old Testament theology. He starts speaking to them about the revelation of Christ. He says, I adapt to my situation. That's all Paul's saying. He says, I adapt to the situation and I put you first so that I might win you so that you can be saved for eternity with Jesus Christ. Really simple. Do you not know, verse 24, that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do what we do to get a crown that will last forever. Our mission for the gospel is everlasting. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not punch like a boxer beating the air. He says, no, I strike blow to my body and I make it my slave so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. He says, I discipline myself. I discipline myself. Why? For the gospel of Jesus Christ and for the mission that he's called me to. He says, I don't want to be disqualified. I discipline myself. I don't want my actions to disqualify me or to lead you astray. I put you first. I love God and I love people. I love the heart of the Apostle Paul. Be blessed today.